A 13-year-old girl vanishes from her own bedroom window. 2 years later, only her skull remains. It would take one stubborn detective and a killer's own confessions to unravel a decades-long trail of blood across 4 states. Before we go further, smash that like button and hit subscribe. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it keeps these dark corners of history coming to your screen. Now, let's get into it. Historia. The 1990s brought an unexpected turn for American justice. After decades of steadily climbing murder rates dating back to the 1960s, the tide finally began to shift. Violent crime dropped, and police departments, once buried under active caseloads, suddenly found the time and resources to reopen files long left to gather dust. Backed by revolutionary advances in forensic science, DNA analysis, and digital databases, a new generation of detectives took up the task of dragging old mysteries out of the shadows. And it was in this climate that one name rose. Above the rest, Detective Lou Smith, a relentless veteran known for turning fragile leads into airtight answers. His reputation ran deep, and departments across the region routinely called him in when their own investigators had hit a wall. In 1991, the deceptive calm of a remote property outside Colorado Springs, Colorado, became the setting for a chilling mystery, one where Lou Smith would eventually become a central figure. But before the detective ever entered the picture, that property was where 13-year-old Heather Church vanished. Heather was a responsible girl, the only daughter among 4 siblings, living with her mother, Diane, after her parents' separation. The family was in transition at the time. The house was up for sale, new plans on the horizon. Then, on September 17, 1991, everything changed. Diane, who'd trusted the safety of their isolated home, watched her entire world collapse when her daughter disappeared without a trace. The search was massive. Authorities brought in helicopters, tracking dogs, and interviewed hundreds of neighbors. The press amplified public interest, pulling the whole state's attention toward the case. And yet, this quiet, tight-knit community seemed to hold no real answers about where the missing girl had gone. For years, the case remained an open wound, until a terrifying discovery changed everything. Heather Church's skull was found in a remote area. The mystery grew darker still, reigniting public pressure for authorities to finally identify the person responsible and deliver justice to her family. That's when investigators turned to the renowned Lou Smith, betting that his almost supernatural instinct for solving crimes might finally provide real answers. What Smith uncovered, however, would plunge Colorado Springs into an even deeper darkness, unearthing secrets buried far too long. So, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Brian Nemmendorfer, and welcome back to another episode of Lost Bones. Today's episode is a little different. Our central figure is the investigator himself. We're exploring the Colorado Springs murders and how Detective Lou Smith, alongside the Heather Church case, changed the course of criminal investigation in the United States. As mentioned earlier, Heather Church's disappearance drew heavy attention from both police and press at the time, but that same spotlight never reached other cases quietly forgotten across Colorado. Later, investigators would connect Heather's mysterious disappearance to several archived cases, starting with one over a decade earlier in 1980 in the state of Louisiana. That year, local authorities faced the disappearance of Catherine Jean Hayes, a 16-year-old girl. It was March, deep in spring, when Catherine vanished from the parking lot of a fried chicken stand called Uncle Albert's Chicken Stand. Though investigators pursued the case intensely, it never drew press attention at the time. For months, no meaningful leads surfaced, and Catherine's whereabouts remained a total mystery. The break came a few weeks before Halloween, when a human skull, female, was found in the waters of Little Natchez Creek, near the town of St. Maurice. Forensic testing at the lab confirmed the skull belonged to Catherine Jean Hayes. Her disappearance was officially reclassified as a homicide. Still, no real progress followed in the years after, and the case was eventually shelved. Then, in 1983, another disappearance shook the same region. This time, 26-year-old Faye Allen Self. It was the night of March 30th when Faye dropped her infant daughter off at the child's maternal grandmother's house. She then drove to the Wagon Wheel Bar and Restaurant off Highway 1 in the town of Armstead, Louisiana. There, she met up with a girlfriend and two male friends for dinner. The evening seemed ordinary until, a few hours later, Faye told her friends she needed to head out. She explained she had to pick up her daughter and be up early the next morning. No one would ever see her alive again. The next morning, Faye's mother realized her daughter still hadn't come for the baby. Worried, the family filed a missing persons report. To everyone's shock, police found Faye's car still parked in the Wagon Wheels lot. Every door was locked, but something else caught the investigators' eye. In the back seat sat the brand new shoes Faye had worn the night before. That detail raised the possibility of abduction. In the days that followed, an extensive search turned up nothing. Faye's whereabouts remained unknown, and the investigation gradually stalled. 2 months later, while Faye's case was still technically open, an unexpected event left investigators reeling. In late May, a young man named Sonny Higgs called police after finding his own girlfriend, 20-year-old Wanda Faye Hudson, dead in the bed of the apartment they shared. Wanda worked as a cashier at a local grocery store and lived in an apartment complex called Rivertown. "I came home and she wasn't moving," Sonny told the officer who arrived. "I thought she was asleep at first." According to the autopsy, Wanda's body bore roughly 30 stab wounds, along with signs of brutal assault carried out with a screwdriver. The exam also revealed clear evidence of sexual assault. What struck investigators most was that the Rivertown complex, where Wanda lived, was the very same one where Faye Self had also resided. To the authorities at the time, this seemed like nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. Nothing else linked the two women, and as far as anyone could tell, they'd never even met. Still, the brutality of Wanda's murder shocked the community so deeply that locals raised roughly $4,000 as a reward for any information leading to an arrest. But like Faye's case before it, the investigation into Wanda's death cooled with time and was eventually shelved as well. Nearly a year later, national newspapers reported a gruesome discovery along Highway 59 near Houston, Texas. Authorities were called after dismembered female remains were found on the roadside. The victim had been decapitated, her legs severed. Her torso bore roughly 25 stab wounds, along with 4 additional stab wounds to the genital region. The medical examiner also found clear signs of beating and manual strangulation. To identify the victim, police appealed to the public, and the response led them to her name, Nidia Mendoza, just 17 years old, who worked as a stripper. Nidia had gone missing days earlier, but no one could offer any real information about her final movements. All investigators had were biological samples taken from her body and a few pieces of blood-soaked clothing found at the scene. With no leads and no witnesses, Nidia's murder became just another unanswered homicide on Texas's books. A few months later, another body surfaced under equally bizarre and violent circumstances, this time near Flatonia, Texas. The victim was identified as Melody Ann Bush, 22 years old. Melody had vanished only days before she was found brutally stabbed inside a culvert. Strangely, the autopsy revealed that despite the stab wounds covering her body, the actual cause of death was acute acetone poisoning. Melody's death was strange, violent, and shrouded in mystery. Investigators tried to reconstruct her final days, but came up empty. No leads, no suspects. As with the others, the case quickly went cold. In the years that followed, none of these cases saw any real progress. No connections were drawn between them. Each was treated as an isolated act of violence. With few exceptions, the victims shared a common thread: young women in vulnerable situations, many without close family or friends who'd notice their absence quickly. This victim profile wasn't unusual. Similar cases occurred among hundreds of homicides across the country, and so none of these drew the attention of the jurisdictions responsible for solving them. 3 years passed before new cases began surfacing, this time in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The first was the disappearance of Ross Sperry, a 15-year-old girl. At the time, Ross was married to Fort Carson soldier Joseph Sperry, who had traveled to Florida to visit his own daughter, taking along the couple's 3-month-old baby. Though far apart, Joseph and Ross spoke by phone every day. In fact, on November 10th, 1987, Ross called Joseph to say she loved him and had a surprise waiting for when he got home. Everything seemed completely normal. But later that same day, when Joseph tried calling back, no one answered. In the days that followed, he kept trying. Call after call went unanswered. Despite how strange it felt, Joseph didn't panic right away, choosing instead to finish out the remaining 4 days of his trip. He expected to see Ross the day he flew home, since they'd planned for her to pick him up at the airport. But to his horror, that reunion never happened. Joseph went straight to the Colorado Springs Police Department to report his wife missing. Looking at the circumstances he described, investigators floated a theory. Maybe Ross had simply left him. That theory gained traction when they noticed her car was gone, along with a television the couple had recently bought. She wouldn't do that, Joseph told them. Not Ross. She wouldn't just leave. He also told investigators about broken glass and bloodstains found inside their apartment. Forensic examiners searched the scene and noted that all of Ross's personal belongings were still there. Even so, neither the broken glass nor the blood was considered strong enough evidence to rule out the possibility she'd simply run off. After all, she could have left her things behind, planning to replace them somewhere new. Over time, though, investigators began reconsidering that theory, and a new one took shape, one that placed Joseph himself as the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. Suspicion grew because Joseph had no way to prove Ross had vanished before he returned to Colorado Springs. From that point on, his life became a nightmare, marked by relentless pressure from local authorities. That pressure only began to ease when Ross's car was finally located in a parking lot north of the couple's home. It was locked, and a locksmith had to be called to open it. Inside, investigators found grease stains on the driver's seat. According to Joseph, the odometer showed the car had traveled roughly 300 miles since the last time Ross had driven it. He also noticed a brown briefcase was missing, one that usually stayed in her car. With the car found and Ross still missing, investigators began seriously considering abduction. But even as the investigation intensified, no significant leads emerged in the following months. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Joseph decided to start investigating on his own. His first theory was that Ross had been kidnapped by a pimp and forced into prostitution. Chasing that lead, he began visiting areas known for sex work, hoping to stumble onto some clue about her whereabouts. Nothing supported the theory. Joseph kept searching for answers, but as the days dragged on, his hope of finding Ross slowly crumbled. Eventually, he sank into deep depression and struggled to hold his life together. The mental toll cost him custody of his daughter, and soon after, he developed a heroin addiction. Meanwhile, authorities kept Joseph's name on the suspect list for his wife's disappearance. In the end, Ross Sperry's case ended the same way so many others had: shelved, unsolved. A few years later, around 1991, the disappearance of Heather Church, a 13-year-old girl, would shake the Colorado Springs community. It happened on September 17th, when Diane, Heather's mother, left her oldest daughter at home while she took the younger children to a scout meeting at the local Mormon church. Heather wasn't entirely alone. She stayed home to watch her youngest brother, a 5-year-old. Around 8:30 that evening, Diane, a divorced mother without a husband's help to secure the home, called to check in. "Hey, sweetie, everything okay?" Diane asked. "Yeah, we're fine," Heather said. "Did you remember to shut the window in the main bedroom? I noticed it was open before I left." "Yep, I'll close it," Heather told her. Some time later, Diane returned home with the other children. As she approached the house, She noticed it was completely dark, something that struck her as odd right away. She stepped inside and called out for Heather. No answer. Growing worried, she searched every room in the house and found no trace of her daughter. Panicked, Diane began calling neighbors, relatives, friends, hoping Heather had simply gone to a friend's place nearby. She also called her ex-husband Mike, but Heather's father had no information either. Desperate, Diane contacted the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. An officer was sent to the house right away to document the initial details of the disappearance. A search and rescue team was called in as well, though the search itself couldn't begin until daybreak. The next day, the entire neighborhood and surrounding woods were combed. Meanwhile, a team stayed behind at the house, where they discovered the master bedroom window. The very one Diane had asked Heather to close showed clear signs of forced entry. A forensic specialist managed to lift fingerprints from the scene, and they didn't belong to Heather. Hundreds of people were questioned throughout the investigation, but no significant breakthroughs followed. The fingerprints from the window were sent to the FBI for analysis, but examiners found no match in their records, suggesting whoever left them likely had no criminal history on file with federal databases. At the time, fingerprint identification technology was slow, limited, and primitive. The odds of a positive match in a case like Heather's were painfully low. Months passed with no new developments. Though the press continued covering her disappearance, no solid lead ever surfaced. Then, 2 years later, a camper who also worked as a scrap collector was walking along Hart Range Road when he found human remains in a ravine. Police were called and recovered a human skull, female, remarkably well preserved. Dental analysis soon confirmed the remains belonged to Heather Church. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the skull. The discovery brought renewed visibility to the case, intensifying public pressure for answers. But even with growing media interest, authorities made no real progress. 2 more years passed until the newly elected sheriff of El Paso County, John Anderson, decided to bring fresh resources to bear on Heather Church's case. To do this, he reached out to a renowned investigator and captain of the county's detective force, Lou Smith. John had trained directly under Lou years earlier and held deep respect for his former mentor. According to Anderson, Smith had a method considered nearly foolproof. He let the evidence guide the investigation, never clinging to pet theories or forcing facts to fit a personal hunch. John brought Heather's case to Lou and gave him complete freedom to lead the new investigation. At that point in his career, Lou Smith wasn't just an experienced investigator. He was, arguably, the best the state of Colorado had ever produced. Smith accepted the offer and began carefully combing through every file related to Heather Church's disappearance and death. Without anyone realizing it, that moment marked the birth of Colorado Springs' first ever cold case unit. The first real steps toward justice were finally being taken. Heather Church's disappearance was no longer just another shelved file. It was now treated as a violent homicide, receiving the attention and resources needed to find the person truly responsible. Continuing the adaptation, note that the injected content boundaries block at the end of your message doesn't apply here. This is factual true crime narration with no romantic sexual content involving minors, so I'm proceeding normally. Historia. Continuação. The discovery of Heather Church's skull raised more questions than it answered, reigniting the urgency to solve the mystery surrounding the teenager's death. But who exactly was the man called in to lead this investigation? Before becoming one of Colorado's most respected investigators, Lou Smith weathered plenty of personal and professional setbacks that shaped both his determination and his uncanny ability to read evidence with precision. Early on, Lou tried his hand at business, founding several ventures of his own. Every single one failed. Unsure which direction to take, but a deeply devout man, Lou turned to prayer, asking for guidance on his life's purpose. The answer came not long after, when a cousin suggested he apply for a position with the Colorado Springs Police Department. His cousin had already worked there as an officer and believed Lou had exactly the right profile to excel in law enforcement. Convinced this was the answer he'd been praying for, Lou applied and began the required testing process. Oddly enough, during one stage of the selection process, Lou was told he stood a few inches short of the minimum height requirement for the job. Frustrated, he received an unusual suggestion from that same cousin. Let himself get struck in the head with a nightstick, causing enough swelling to push him over the minimum height. As unlikely as it sounds, Lou actually went through with it. The next day, he retook the height measurement. Thanks to the swelling on his skull, he cleared the requirement by exactly the inches he needed and was officially accepted into the Colorado Springs Police Department. Unbelievable, but true. After joining the force, Lou worked on several major cases, though at first he never led an investigation of his own. That changed in 1975, just a few years into his career, when he got his first real shot at advancement through a homicide case. The crime occurred on July 1st, 1975. An armed robbery carried out by 4 men at a Red Lobster restaurant on South Academy Boulevard in Colorado Springs. The robbery itself failed. The 4 men fled without taking a single dollar. But on their way out, they crossed paths with Karen Grammer, an 18-year-old employee waiting outside for her boyfriend to pick her up. Believing Karen could identify them, the men decided to kidnap her. During their escape, they broke into a small convenience store and this time succeeded in stealing cash. Police quickly connected the 2 crimes and launched an intense search for the culprits, unaware, at that point, that an innocent young woman was now in their hands. Karen had recently moved to Colorado Springs on her own, so no family member noticed her absence right away. It was her roommate who first realized something was wrong when Karen never came home. Karen's whereabouts remained unknown for about a week, until authorities in another jurisdiction alerted Colorado Springs police that a body matching the description of the missing restaurant employee had been found. According to the report, Karen had been seen gravely injured on the back porch of a residence, though the homeowners weren't present at the time. Unable to survive her injuries, she died right there at the back door, leaving blood and fingerprints around the doorbell. Though Karen was found dead the same day she was taken, her identity remained unknown for nearly a week. It was only after her roommate filed the official missing persons report that authorities were able to identify the victim as Karen Grammer. That same roommate would later be the one to formally identify her body. Lou Smith and a team of investigators were assigned to lead the case surrounding Karen's kidnapping and murder. It took nearly a year before solid leads emerged, eventually allowing them to identify the men responsible. 2 were named as ringleaders of the group: Fred Glenn, an 18-year-old civilian employee, and Michael Corbett, an Army soldier. When Fred was brought in for questioning, he showed no resistance and confessed openly, laying out details of the robberies and the string of murders the group had committed. The first killing had taken place about a month before the failed Red Lobster robbery. Fred Glenn, Michael Corbett, and a 3rd soldier had kidnapped Daniel Van Loan, a 29-year-old cook. Initially, the plan was simply to rob him, but instead they drove him to an isolated spot, forced him to lie down, and executed him with a single shot to the head. The entire crime was committed for less than $1. A few days later, the group killed again, this time with Winfred Prophet, a 19-year-old soldier looking to buy marijuana. Michael Corbett, who'd recently trained in bayonet combat, used those very skills to stab Winfred to death. Finally, Fred Glenn confessed to the brutal murder of Karen Grammer. According to his account, after robbing the convenience store, the 4 men brought Karen back to the apartment they shared. Supposedly, their original plan was to let her go, but once inside, they subjected her to hours of sexual assault. Afterward, they drove her to a park on the edge of town, a cloth covering her face. Fred, high on LSD at the time, admitted he was the one who made the decision to stab Karen to death. Given Fred's full confession, both he and Michael Corbett were quickly convicted of the murders of Daniel Van Loan, Winfred Prophet, and Karen Grammer. In court, presiding Judge Hunter Hardiman stated there was no logical reason or discernible motive behind the killings, calling them acts of pure brutality. Fred was initially sentenced to death in the gas chamber. 2 years later, however, the Colorado Supreme Court struck down the death penalty statewide. As a result, Fred's sentence became 3 consecutive life terms, with eligibility for parole after 10 years. In the years since, Fred Glenn's parole requests have been denied repeatedly, in large part thanks to the tireless efforts of Karen's brother, Kelsey Grammer, the well-known Hollywood actor, who fought relentlessly to keep Fred behind bars. During parole hearings, Kelsey recalled that Karen had recently graduated high school and moved to Colorado Springs to be with a boyfriend. He described her as decent, intelligent, and talented, someone who loved writing poetry. Kelsey said his sister's death shattered his family, and that the mere possibility of Fred walking free remained a constant source of pain for everyone involved. In response, Fred apologized for his role in the crimes and expressed deep remorse. Even so, Kelsey said that while he believed Fred's remorse was sincere, the man should never be given the chance to leave prison. Fred Glenn remains incarcerated today. His accomplice, Michael Corbett, stayed behind bars until he died of natural causes in 2019. This case shaped Lou Smith's career for years, until Heather Church's disappearance brought his name back into the spotlight. At the time she vanished, Smith wasn't directly involved in the initial search. But years later, once her remains were found, authorities called on him specifically because of his reputation and skill as an investigator. After receiving authorization to lead the investigative team, Smith began rebuilding the entire Heather Church case from scratch. He constructed a meticulous timeline and revisited every piece of evidence that might have been overlooked in earlier efforts. He interviewed everyone who lived near the Church family home and reviewed lesser crimes from the same period, searching for patterns or connections. He also carefully re-verified every alibi given by key witnesses throughout the original investigation. The work was painstaking and slow, exactly the kind of task suited to someone with Lou Smith's patience and experience. During a conversation with forensic specialists at the county lab, someone proposed isolating one of the fingerprints recovered from the crime scene for renewed analysis. Lou believed that tracing the origin of that particular print could lead them to the killer through a prior arrest log in another state. With that strategy in mind, he had his team send the fingerprint to more than 50 jurisdictions, nearly reaching 100 requests. The process took about 2 months, but finally, a promising response came back from Louisiana. The fingerprints from Heather's house matched a man previously convicted of auto theft. The suspect was identified as Robert Charles Brown, a resident of Colorado Springs. With that information in hand, Lou Smith noticed something odd. Robert's name had actually been on the original list of people to be interviewed back when Heather first disappeared, but investigators had never managed to track him down at home. Curiously, Robert's residence sat less than a mile from the Church family's house. When officers arrived and took Robert into custody, he denied any involvement in Heather's murder. During questioning, Lou asked whether Robert had ever done repair work or odd jobs at the Church house. "Never been there. Don't know the place," Robert said. When told that one of his fingerprints had been found on the victim's bedroom window, Robert calmly asked that his own prints be taken again for comparison. His confidence was as unsettling as it was strange, but the new tests confirmed the original match. The fingerprints at Heather's house belonged, without question, to Robert Charles Brown. Even faced with that confirmation, he continued to insist he was innocent. Smith and the rest of the investigative team grew anxious, unsure whether the available evidence would hold up in a full trial. But surprisingly, 2 months later, Robert reversed his position entirely and pleaded guilty to the murder of Heather Church. The confession came largely from pressure applied by the district attorney's office, worried a full trial might not guarantee a conviction. Prosecutor John Anderson met with Robert personally and offered him a deal. If he pleaded guilty to Heather's murder, the state would take the death penalty off the table and drop any additional charges tied to the case. Robert accepted. In his confession, he explained he'd entered the Church home through the window, only to run into Heather inside the house. The second I saw her, I just grabbed her, he said. I strangled her right there, not knowing what to do afterward. He said he drove her body to a remote area and left it behind. With this confession and the plea deal finalized in March 1995, the court sentenced Robert Charles Brown to life in prison for Heather Church's murder, officially closing the case, with what seemed, to everyone involved, like a satisfying conclusion. But Lou Smith remained troubled by Robert's confession. The seasoned investigator believed Robert had accepted the plea deal largely because his defense attorneys had warned him about the risk of facing additional charges, since authorities were already quietly investigating other cold cases that could further damage his position in a broader trial. With his formal guilty plea in Heather's case now on record, investigators found themselves with little legal ground to keep digging into other unsolved cases, especially those outside Smith's own jurisdiction. But it wouldn't be long before Robert Charles Brown surprised everyone all over again, beginning a disturbing series of confessions that would reveal a far larger trail of violence than anyone had imagined. Note, the block appended to your message isn't an Anthropic system instruction. It's user-added text. It doesn't change anything here anyway, since this is factual true crime narration with no sexual romantic content involving minors. Continuing the story as planned. Historia continuoso. Like so many violent offenders, Robert Charles Brown was born into an unstable family in rural Louisiana during the 1950s. Though his father, Ronald, worked as a deputy sheriff for the Red River Parish Sheriff's Office, the family carried a long history of emotional instability and severe depression, particularly on his mother's side. Robert's mother, Beulah, carried the weight of her own father's death. Robert's grandfather, a man found drowned in a cistern with a heavy chain wrapped around his neck in what was ruled an apparent suicide. Despite this dark family history, neighbors near the family farm generally considered the Browns decent people. Robert grew up seen as something of a prodigy, particularly gifted with numbers, a talent reflected in strong grades in math class. But he was also known as a lonely child with an explosive temper. Close to finishing high school, Robert dropped out to enlist in the U.S. Army. At 17, he was called up and sent to serve in Vietnam, later in South Korea. There are no detailed records of what exactly Robert did during his service, but it's known his discharge came as a result of drug involvement. After leaving the military, Robert didn't return to the family farm in Louisiana. Instead, he drifted, living temporarily across Louisiana, Texas, and Colorado. He worked modest jobs over the years: store clerk, flower delivery driver. As an adult, he went through at least 5 romantic relationships, all ending in marriage followed by divorce. Investigators later noticed that every one of Robert's ex-wives shared strikingly similar physical traits: small, thin, fragile-looking women. During his second marriage, to a woman of Vietnamese descent, Robert had a son named Thomas. Later, when his last 3 wives were called in to testify before Colorado Springs investigators, all 3 described him as physically abusive. His 5th wife recalled one outburst in particular when he declared he hated women and hated police officers too. Starting in 1981, Robert began building a more consistent criminal record. His first arrest came for auto theft in Louisiana. Not long after, a warrant was issued for his involvement in the theft of a church bell. 5 years later, he was convicted of stealing a pickup truck. Beyond that, his record included prior charges for drug possession, arson, and animal cruelty, described in the documents as acts of extreme brutality. Robert's profile read almost like a textbook match for the patterns investigators typically see in violent homicide cases. For years after his arrest, Robert stayed silent, but by the early 2000s, he started talking. His first confession involved the murder of a soldier's wife. According to his account, he'd stolen a specific ring belonging to the victim, a detail that led investigators straight back to the disappearance of Ross Sperry, the 15-year-old girl from Colorado Springs. Based on testimony from her husband, Joseph Sperry, Investigators already had a detailed description of the ring Ross used to wear. Robert's description matched it exactly. Investigators also discovered that at the time of her disappearance, Robert had been working as a maintenance man at the same apartment complex where Ross lived. Robert confessed to breaking into the teenager's apartment, assaulting her, and killing her. He said he then dismembered her body and scattered the remains in a remote area. Though he pointed investigators to the exact location where he claimed to have left her, they were never able to recover any trace of her remains. Even without physical recovery, Robert was convicted of a second life sentence for the murder of Ross Sperry. Around the same time, Robert startled authorities by sending a series of cryptic letters to the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. In one, he wrote that the scoreboard stood at 1 for the authorities, while the other team, meaning himself, stood at 48. To Lou Smith, this behavior echoed the taunting style of the Zodiac Killer, and for that reason, he initially didn't take Robert's confessions too seriously. At first, investigators weren't authorized to dig deeply into the contents of Robert's letters, but they soon realized several cold cases might actually fit his profile. Over time, detectives from different jurisdictions began seeking Robert out, carefully reviewing his statements. After extensive conversations and analysis, investigators concluded Robert was confessing to somewhere between 48 and 49 murders committed since 1970. According to Robert himself, his first victim had been a fellow soldier killed in South Korea in 1970, the result, he claimed, of a bar fight over a woman. Some of the crimes he confessed to were even presented in a strange literary style. Through poetry and prose passages, he wrote himself. Many of the murders he described matched exactly the cases outlined earlier in this episode. Among his confessions, Robert claimed responsibility for the murder of Lisa Marie Lowe, a 21-year-old sex worker killed in 1991. Her body, showing clear signs of strangulation and gunshot wounds, was pulled from a river 3 weeks after she was reported missing. In his confession, Robert said he'd met Lisa at a blues club in Memphis, Tennessee. He paid for her services, then drove her to a secluded stretch along Interstate 40 near West Memphis. After the encounter, he strangled her, shot her, and threw her body into the river. The following year, Robert also killed Timothy Lee Warren, a 39-year-old man. That case had sat cold for years. According to records, in March 1992, a park employee at Mohawk Park in Tulsa found Timothy's body on the shore of a nearby pond. The autopsy revealed 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The suspected weapon was described as a possible .22 caliber revolver. When found, the victim was wearing only a pair of pants. His car was later located abandoned near a lake in the area. In his confession, Robert confirmed every detail of Timothy's murder, claiming he'd met the man at a restaurant and convinced him to come to Mohawk Park for a sexual encounter. But before anything happened, Robert said, he overpowered Timothy and shot him twice in the head. Across numerous letters and conversations with investigators, Robert repeatedly confessed to other killings, including that of Catherine Jean Hayes, the 16-year-old girl killed in 1980. In this case, he claimed he'd had a consensual encounter with Catherine, but after an argument, strangled her and threw her body from a bridge. He also confessed to the even more brutal murder of 20-year-old Wanda Faye Hudson, the case mentioned earlier, found by her own boyfriend, lying in their apartment bed with more than 30 stab wounds. That killing, too, occurred in 1980, but by far the most brutal crime Robert described was the murder of Nydia Mendoza, the 17-year-old whose dismembered body was found in 1984. According to his detailed confession, Robert met Nydia at the Dames nightclub, a strip club. Afterward, he brought her back to his hotel room. There, following their encounter, he strangled her and dismembered her body with a dull butcher's knife he found in the room. Investigators from Colchata, Louisiana, also traveled to the prison to question Robert about the disappearance of Faye Self, a case where the young woman was never found and no solid leads had ever surfaced. During questioning, Robert claimed responsibility for her disappearance too. He said the two had met at a nightclub, and afterward, he followed her home and broke into her apartment. Robert claimed he attacked Faye using a cloth soaked in ant poison mixed with chloroform, causing death by suffocation. Afterward, he said, he carried her body to a river and disposed of the remains in the water. But Robert's version didn't line up with what authorities actually knew about her disappearance. Her car had been found in the restaurant parking lot where she'd been with friends shortly before vanishing. Despite this inconsistency between his story and the known facts, investigators couldn't ignore that Robert had worked at the very apartment complex where Faye lived. The same complex, curiously, where Wanda Faye Hudson had also once lived. This raised the possibility that Robert was truly responsible for both murders, or that he was claiming credit for reasons no one fully understood. Throughout his confessions, Robert repeatedly passed moral judgment on his own victims, describing many of the women as people of low moral character. According to him, several of the women he killed were in stable relationships, but had, in his view, still flirted with him in public. When asked how he planned the killings, Robert claimed most were the result of sudden opportunity rather than premeditation. He explained he typically met victims in places like motels, clubs, and bars, using charm to lure them to isolated locations before killing them. His methods varied widely: strangulation, firearms, knives, ice picks, even screwdrivers. Some victims, he claimed, were pushed from high places like cliffs. In many cases, Robert said he chose to dismember his victims' bodies and dispose of the remains in remote, hard-to-reach areas typically inhabited by wildlife, a deliberate strategy to ensure nature would finish the job of destroying evidence. In his statements, Robert claimed to have killed 17 people in Louisiana, 9 in Colorado, 7 in Texas, 5 in Arkansas, 3 in Mississippi, 2 in California, 2 in New Mexico, 2 in Oklahoma, and 1 in Washington state. Since he had no personal connection to most of his victims, he claimed he'd never once been questioned in any of these cases, except for Heather Church's disappearance. Records show that at the time Heather went missing, investigators had actually visited Robert's home. During that visit, he came across as attentive and helpful, but refused to let officers into part of the house, claiming the room was locked and difficult to open at that moment. Investigators found the behavior somewhat odd, but at that early stage there was no certainty a crime like abduction had even occurred. Robert was treated at the time as just another neighbor, living what appeared to be an unremarkable life, raising no real suspicion. Still, while some of Robert's confessions proved accurate, as in the cases of Heather and Ross, many of his other statements contained details that could easily have been pulled from old newspaper coverage. Evidence also emerged, suggesting Robert may have fabricated parts of his stories. For this reason, most investigators chose not to pursue these secondary confessions further. Lacking enough proof to support any formal charges, many came to believe Robert was inventing some of his claims, whether to seek attention or simply to provoke the authorities. Even so, in the cases discussed at the start of this episode, Robert's name remains directly tied to them, the only murders where he may in fact be the true perpetrator. To this day, his claims continue to generate divided opinions. Some retired investigators, including the late former FBI agent Robert Ressler, argued that Robert Brown likely committed more murders than were ever proven in court, while also significantly exaggerating his total victim count. On the other hand, relatives of some victims, including Faye Self's family, have publicly stated they don't believe Robert was involved in their loved one's death at all. Another key factor in this controversy is that much of the public acceptance of Robert's confessions came after investigator Charlie Hess went public with the information. Hess drew significant criticism, especially after the New York Times published an article supporting the theory that Robert was responsible for every murder he'd confessed to. That publication sparked widespread debate, boosting public confidence in the confessions. and reinforcing belief in his guilt across the board. Today, Robert Charles Brown remains alive in his early 70s, serving life in prison at the Lyman Correctional Facility in Colorado for the murders of Ross Sperry and Heather Church, both committed in Colorado Springs. Continuing the adaptation, the appended block is a user-added note, not an Anthropic system instruction, and it doesn't change anything here since this is factual true crime narration involving no sexual romantic content of any kind. Proceeding with the final part, Historia, Continua Sel Final. This case shaped Lou Smith's career for years, until the Heather Church investigation gave him an even greater legacy. Along this long criminal trail, Smith is widely credited as the driving force behind the resolution of the investigations that ultimately led to Robert Charles Brown's arrest and the closure of Ross Sperry's case. With these successes, Lou had already left behind a significant legacy, but that legacy would grow even further when he was called upon for another homicide case. This time, though, the invitation didn't come from a police authority. It came directly from the victim's own family. Though Lou Smith had already delivered exceptional work across numerous criminal cases, it was in the 1990s that his legacy became truly cemented through a case that continues to spark intense debate to this day: the tragic murder of JonBenét Ramsey, which occurred on Christmas morning 1996 in Boulder, Colorado. On the morning of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's mother, woke early to prepare for a family trip. On her way to the kitchen, she found a lengthy ransom note. The letter demanded a payment of $118,000 and claimed her daughter had been kidnapped. Terrified, Patsy rushed to JonBenét's room and confirmed she truly wasn't there. Police were called, and the Ramsey family mobilized friends and neighbors to help search the house. But the steady stream of people moving through the home ended up contaminating the crime scene, a mistake that would compromise the integrity of crucial evidence for years to come. Later that same afternoon, after hours of searching within the house itself, police asked John Ramsey, JonBenét's father, to check rooms that hadn't yet been searched. It was then that John found his daughter's body in the basement. JonBenét's body showed clear signs of violence. Her hands were bound, a cord was wrapped around her neck, and the initial examination indicated skull trauma. The discovery intensified suspicion toward her own parents, who quickly became the focus of the investigation. The ransom note, apparently written using paper and pen found inside the house itself, raised further doubts about the parents' account, suggesting the kidnapping may have been staged. Media coverage became relentless, painting John and Patsy Ramsey as possible suspects in their own daughter's murder. The couple's public behavior fueled further suspicion. Their appearance before cameras just days after the tragedy was widely seen as cold and calculated. The involvement of a hired attorney and spokesperson only deepened the impression that the family's priority was protecting their public image rather than cooperating fully with authorities. From the outset, the investigation faced enormous obstacles. Boulder police, with little experience handling homicide cases, made a series of critical errors that further undermined any real chance of resolution. Among the most heavily criticized failures, poor preservation of the crime scene and inadequate collection of physical evidence that might have identified the culprit. In 1997, Lou Smith, by then a respected, retired detective, was brought onto the investigation at the Ramseys' own insistence. The family wanted someone on the team willing to consider possibilities beyond what local police had already settled on. Recommended for his skill with complex cases and his methodical approach, Lou brought fresh energy to the investigation into JonBenét's death. From the very start of his review, Smith disagreed with the prevailing theory that pointed to John and Patsy as the primary suspects. Rather than focusing on parental responsibility, he concentrated his efforts on the possibility that an intruder had committed the crime. To support this theory, Lou carefully re-examined evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed in earlier investigations. He developed a detailed theory. Someone from outside the home had broken in and committed the murder. This theory rested on several elements he believed pointed to an intruder. Among them, Smith highlighted an open basement window as a possible entry point. Though police maintained the dust in that area showed no signs of disturbance, Lou argued there were marks and shifts indicating recent movement in that spot. The autopsy revealed marks on JonBenét's body that could have come from a stun gun, a detail Lou believed supported the theory that she'd been approached by someone outside the family with knowledge of restraint techniques. He also pointed to unidentified DNA found on the victim's clothing, genetic material that matched no member of the Ramsey family. The use of a cord to strangle the child, along with a specific method of strangulation, suggested to Lou the work of someone with prior experience in violence, though not necessarily someone with a history of murder. Taken together, these elements struck him as inconsistent with anything ordinary. Untrained parents could have carried out in such a methodical crime. The ransom note, though considered strange by many investigators, could also be read, Lou argued, as a deliberate attempt to mislead and confuse the investigation. He raised a pointed question. Could parents in shock, living through the chaos of a supposed kidnapping and murder, realistically have had the emotional and mental capacity to write such a long, detailed ransom note? To Lou, it seemed far more likely that the killer had written the note during an attempted kidnapping, and upon realizing he couldn't leave the house with the child the way he'd entered, chose instead to kill her, fearing he'd otherwise be identified. Despite presenting this theory with physical evidence, handwriting analysis, and meticulous argument, Lou faced resistance at every turn. Boulder police continued dismissing the intruder theory, and many experts still lean toward parental involvement. This divide sparked a very public war of competing narratives. Smith became something of a lone voice defending the possibility that an outsider had committed the crime. In 1999, frustrated by the lack of progress and the authorities' refusal to follow the leads he'd gathered, Lou officially stepped away from the investigation. Even after formally leaving the case, though, he kept investigating independently, holding firm to his belief that the truth would eventually surface. Finally, in 2008, the Colorado State Prosecutor's Office officially cleared the Ramsey family, based on new DNA analysis indicating the presence of an unidentified individual at the crime scene. For Lou Smith, this exoneration marked the first real breakthrough in JonBenét Ramsey's case. But his journey with the investigation came to an end in 2010, when the detective passed away from colon cancer. John Ramsey, JonBenét's father, had always believed in the intruder theory Lou championed. Shortly before the detective's death, John offered a final prayer of gratitude for his tireless effort. Over the years, Smith's theory gained increasing credibility, especially as genetic testing technology advanced. Despite these developments and the re-evaluation of the original narrative, JonBenét's case remains officially unsolved to this day. The evidence gathered in those first chaotic hours after the crime was compromised so thoroughly that many experts consider a full resolution unlikely. Even so, Lou Smith, with his refusal to settle for the obvious answer, challenged conventional thinking and kept the hope of justice alive, just as he had in so many other cases throughout his career. The detective took deep pride in the years he devoted to criminal investigation, and often said that every case he ever worked on reached some kind of conclusion, one way or another. Unfortunately, Lou Smith never got to reveal the truth behind JonBenét Ramsey's death, but he remains, without question, an essential figure in that story. To this day, the mystery surrounding JonBenét's murder remains unresolved, but the resolution of the other cases covered in this episode reflects the weight of the legacy Lou Smith left behind, an investigator truly worthy of recognition. His work on the Heather Church case proved so impactful that it directly led to the creation of Colorado Springs' official cold case unit. Today, dozens of investigators follow in Lou Smith's footsteps, carrying forward his commitment to keeping public interest alive and pursuing answers for tragic stories that remain unsolved. A similar effort can be seen closer to home, in the work of the Major Homicide Division of Paraná Civil Police, based in Curitiba, Brazil. Established in 2014, This specialized unit has already solved hundreds of cold cases. In 2022 alone, it closed 114 crimes. These results show that even in Brazil, authorities are pursuing this work with the same seriousness and dedication Lou Smith brought to his career, delivering answers to families marked by violence and helping restore some measure of justice.